Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is a lesson on planning stakeholder engagement. The first and only stakeholder engagement process in the planning process group is plan stakeholder engagement, and it has as its output the stakeholder engagement plan. This is not the first process in stakeholder engagement. The first process is identify stakeholders, which created the stakeholder register, and which is part of the initiating process group, along with the develop project charter process. The identify stakeholder process has already gathered information about stakeholders, including their requirements and expectations, and done stakeholder analysis and classification. Stakeholder engagement and communications are so closely related that it's instructive to explore the similarities and differences between them. Communication develops the relationships necessary for successful project and program outcomes. And the communications plan is a documented approach to effectively and efficiently engage stakeholders by presenting relevant information in a timely manner. Notice that communications management is about developing relationships and engaging stakeholders, which sounds like it should be part of stakeholder engagement. But the key differentiator here is that it does this specifically by presenting relevant information in a timely manner. It has the same goal as stakeholder engagement, but its methods are specifically centered around communication in order to achieve the goal of stakeholder engagement. In this sense, you could consider communications management as a branch of stakeholder engagement, similar to the way that each of the knowledge areas is ultimately about risk management, but focused on the best practices for risk management for that particular knowledge area. Stakeholder engagement is focused on developing strategies for effectively engaging stakeholders in project decisions and execution. You know that communication involves not only words and images, but also body language and other indirect communication, including everything you do to interact directly or indirectly with someone. If you think about it, everything you do to engage stakeholders will communicate something. All of your stakeholder engagement efforts will include an element of communication as a natural side effect. But stakeholder engagement is not focused on the communication part, but on the engagement part, whereas communication is focused on the communication part, but with the goal of engaging stakeholders. It's like stakeholder engagement and communication are two sides of the same coin. You can't really do one without the other, but they're still different. Which is why these two knowledge areas are so closely related, why the processes affect each other, which in turn is why they should be done together, including when the plans and results of each are reviewed periodically throughout the life cycle of the project. It used to be that project managers focused on and measured the success of projects as delivering the agreed scope on time and within budget. All the other factors were outside the scope of project success. Whether the project's outcomes provided the anticipated benefits was someone else's responsibility. The organization, the program, the portfolio, the project sponsor, whoever, but not the project manager. The project manager's job was to do the job assigned with the money and time allocated. And if stakeholders weren't satisfied with the results, well, then that was their problem for not giving the project manager the right job to do. After all, if your boss gives you a job to do and you do it well, but it's not what was needed, how is that your fault? Well, that was the prevailing perspective for a long time, but not anymore. We've learned that we have to broaden our view and our responsibilities as project managers. We need to be involved in making sure that project objectives do deliver the expected benefits and that stakeholders are satisfied, not only with the results, but with how we get those results. Experience has shown us that projects are much more likely to be successful when we take this broader view and recognize and maximize stakeholder engagement and satisfaction. Not only does this benefit our projects, it helps the project management profession to demonstrate increasing value and to grow in credibility. These days, stakeholder satisfaction needs to be included as a project objective, if not the most important project objective, which means that quality and long-term benefits will naturally be included as project objectives along with the more traditional objectives of scope, schedule, and cost. This requires continuous communication with project stakeholders to understand their needs and expectations, to address issues, to manage the conflicting interests of the various stakeholders, and to foster the level of stakeholder engagement needed for project success. Not only do we as project managers need to take a broader view to include stakeholder satisfaction in our project objectives, but we also need to take a broader view of who our project stakeholders are. It used to be that you only had to worry about satisfying the project sponsor. After all, they're the one paying for it, right? They should be the one to determine what the project needs to do and how much time and money you have for it. Again, that's too narrow a perspective and will result in surprises later, during the project and after it. Surprises that bring problems and disappointment. The project manager has the responsibility to seek out and understand the needs of those who will be affected by the project. The first stakeholder group that comes to mind is the end user. After all, they're the ones that will be using what the project develops. What if the needs of the end users don't match those of the project sponsor? Do you do what the sponsor wants or what the end users need? The answer is that you need to proactively take the time and effort to understand the end user's needs and then work with the project sponsor to help them also understand these end users' needs and to come up with solutions that satisfy both. And there are many other stakeholder groups that you need to reach out to and understand. In order to have a well-functioning project team, you need to recognize that your project team members are stakeholders. They're certainly affected by the project. So are the functional and resource managers, from which you'll draw people and other resources. Program and portfolio managers are affected, as are other project managers who compete for scarce resources and whose projects may be affected by your project. Other stakeholders in the governing category include your organization's PMO, as well as steering committees and other governing bodies, even corporate shareholders and creditors. And don't forget government agencies, regulators, and the community. We then have customers. Sometimes these are the same as the end users, and sometimes they're not. If someone other than the user is the one who purchases the products or services used by the end user, then you have a distinct stakeholder group to consider. For example, managers and purchasing departments are customers that purchase things for the employees of an organization to use. A parent purchases things for their children, from toys and books to cars and university education. And don't forget your suppliers. They're also affected by your project. Now we come to the main output of planned stakeholder engagement, which is the stakeholder engagement plan. This plan should take into consideration how best to understand and engage with all of these different stakeholder groups. And this plan and its effectiveness need to be reviewed frequently throughout the project. It should promote the productive involvement of stakeholders, not only in decision-making, but also in the execution of the project. It needs to accommodate the different needs and expectations of your stakeholders, and will affect your requirements and your communications. The plan needs to be reviewed and updated frequently, such as at different phases in a multi-phase project, or when different stakeholders come and go, as well as when there are organizational or industry changes. Some of these, such as phase gates, can be scheduled ahead of time, and others should be done as needed. I was managing a project once to develop a new software application to replace an older one, and one of the key stakeholders left and was replaced by someone new who had very different needs. This dramatically changed the functionality of significant portions of the application, and it increased the level of engagement from the client's higher level management as they realized how much of an impact this change in end users had on the requirements of the project. So ask yourself, what are some of the inputs that you can use that will give you information about the stakeholders and their needs and how you can engage with them? This will help you to remember or come up with this list. It starts with the stakeholder register, which lists your key stakeholders and other stakeholders. It includes the analysis that you've already done on the stakeholders. It identifies their needs, expectations, and tolerances, such as their risk tolerance. The project charter also includes a high-level view of the project, its purpose, objectives, and success criteria that should be included as you're considering how to engage with stakeholders and how to align their needs with the overall purpose of the project, objectives, and success, or the other way around, how to align those things with the stakeholders. You have your resource management plan that includes a description of roles and responsibilities of different resources and people involved. The communications management plan has some communication strategies already identified. Your risk management plan includes risk thresholds and attitudes. You'll also want to take a look at assumptions, constraints, changes, issues, and risks from these different documents, because these are often tied to individual stakeholders. From the change log, you get a list of changes that have been requested and approved. You can get some information about different stakeholders' roles on the change control board and changes that affect individual stakeholders. The issues log will have information about who raised an issue, who owns it, and who's affected by it. The same goes for risks, who raised it, who owns it, and who's affected by it. Different schedule activities can be linked to individual stakeholders. And even agreements, both internal and external, can identify other stakeholders and may include some information, restrictions, and other information regarding how to engage with these stakeholders. Enterprise environmental factors include anything that can affect your stakeholder engagement, such as your organization's culture, political climate, governance, personnel administration policies, the risk appetites of your stakeholders, the established communication channels that your organization has, any global, regional, local trends, practices, and habits, as well as the geographic distribution of your facilities and resources. Organizational process assets include all sorts of policies and procedures for things like social media, ethics, security, and how you handle issues, risk, change, and even data management. Policies and requirements regarding organizational communication, guidelines for how you develop information, exchange it, store it, and retrieve it, as well as your lessons learned repository that can contain information about individual stakeholder preferences, as well as software tools that can help to support effective stakeholder engagement. Tools and techniques include expert judgment, of course, especially people who are expert in politics and power structures within your organization, people that are familiar with the enterprise environmental factors, and who have knowledge of specific stakeholders and how best to engage with them. You can also benchmark your stakeholder analysis against other projects, both inside and outside your organization. You'll use data analysis techniques, including analysis of your assumptions and constraints, and root cause analysis. You'll take advantage of decision-making, including the prioritization not only of stakeholders, but of their requirements. And, of course, lots of meetings. Another tool that you might find useful is data mapping. Here you see an example of a data map that has one stakeholder at the center, and you can do this for each of your stakeholders. And you can organize thoughts into different themes. Here you see expectations, requirements, risk, and communications, and you could have others as well. But here is a way that you could visually represent this stakeholder's expectations, their requirements, the risks that they're concerned about, and some of their communications needs. This is a structured way in which you can not only understand their needs, but explore different ways to address them. And then you have the data representation technique of the Stakeholder Engagement Assessment Matrix. That's a mouthful, but it is simply a matrix in which you identify all of the stakeholders and categorize them by whether they're unaware, resistant, neutral, supportive, or leading. Those that are unaware of the project and its objectives, benefits, and impacts. Those that are resistant are aware of the project, but still they're resistant to the project's impacts on them or its objectives. Those who are neutral are aware of the project, but not resistant, but not supportive either. Supportive people are aware of the project and its impacts and support it, and leading stakeholders are aware and actively encouraging the project's success, such as being a project champion. And here in this assessment matrix, you can see that you use C's and D's to indicate the current assessment of where they're at, and D's to represent where you desire them to be. Now, how much do you remember of the inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques of planned stakeholder engagement? The one and only output is the stakeholder engagement plan. For inputs, don't try and memorize them all, but project charter is there, as with all of the other planning processes. Project management plan components include things that have information about people, so resources and their communication needs and their risk tolerances, as well as project documents that have information that could be tied directly to specific stakeholders, including assumptions, changes, issues, risks, scheduled activities, and so on. Agreements will also list individual people and their roles and responsibilities, and there are a number of enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Tools and techniques include, of course, expert judgment, some data gathering techniques, data analysis techniques, decision making, some data representations such as mind maps and the Stakeholder Engagement Assessment Matrix, and meetings. As mentioned earlier, one of the most important trends in stakeholder engagement is to take a broader view of your stakeholders and include employees, suppliers, even shareholders, customers, regulators, lobby groups, environmentalists, financial organizations, even the media. It can also include those who believe they're stakeholders but aren't. Another emerging trend is the concept of co-creation, which is the idea of having greater stakeholder involvement in the creation of the deliverables of your project, as well as the concept of positive and negative value. Positive value can be based on maximizing project benefits by effectively engaging active support from powerful stakeholders, whereas negative value is the total cost of not engaging stakeholders effectively, and its effect not only on the project, but on the long-term benefits of the project, such as higher warranty costs, loss of reputation, and lost market share. A foundational principle of Agile approaches is the increased engagement of stakeholders. The processes require more active engagement and participation, and direct engagement rather than having to go through layers of management to get in touch with someone. In an Agile approach, you can approach them more directly. Also included are the concepts of co-creation, mentioned earlier, in which stakeholders can serve even as project team members. Co-location, which is closely related, in which stakeholders are physically located with the team in the same area or in the same room, the same set of cubicles, or what have you. Another important concept with Agile approaches is transparency. Information radiators are an example. Such information radiators are things that make information readily available. Things such as a whiteboard that has the project status, issues, and even details of the project team's work displayed in a prominent area where anyone can walk by and see for themselves what's going on with the project. For more information on stakeholder engagement, you can refer to these pages of the PMBOK guide. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.